It's time for Unit 6 and the organization of life. So here in Unit 6, what we are going to be doing is we're going to be talking about how life is organized, how different animals and plants came to be, how they have changed, and how we group them, and even how they interact with each other in different ecosystems. So this first lecture is all about ecosystems. And you can find this stuff in Chapter 4 of the new textbook, the one that you have hopefully already downloaded. If you need the instructions on downloading it again, please come see Mr. Hughes or myself and we can get those to you. And you can then download your copy at home and kind of follow along in the chapter. Well, before we can start talking about how organisms interact in ecosystems, we have to talk about what an ecosystem is. And ecosystems are communities, groups of organisms, all right, and the abiotic or non-living factors in that ecosystem or in that area, in that environment. And what we see is that ecosystems don't have clear boundaries. You can't just like draw a line on a map and say, oh, one ecosystem ends here, the other starts here. We can kind of group them in little areas and look at them, but for the most part, things go from one ecosystem to the other. Animals move. In the case of plants, as it says here, the pollen from one plant can blow from a forest into a field, from a forest ecosystem into a field ecosystem. Soil can get washed away from a mountain way up high and end up into a lake. Birds fly from state to state or country to country as we go from winter or from summer to winter, and then again from winter to spring. We start to see these migrations. So this is all showing you that ecosystems are not set and defined, and organisms move into and out of them as they please. Looking a little bit more in depth, all right, here is the world. Look in the biggest picture. In the world, we have this thing called the biosphere. The biosphere is the sphere of life. Bio means life. And what we've got by the biosphere, it's where all living things exist. Some's in the water, some of them are on land, some in the air most of the time. All right, and we can simplify this down to a single level, which is an organism. That's one living individual. If you have a group of those individuals together and look at just the number of that individual, we have a population. Populations are all the same species. All right, they are all the same type of organism. And as we get into evolution and we start talking about adaptations and evolution itself, we talk about it at this population level, not at the organism level. And that's the big problem that arises when people talk about evolution and adaptation. Is the general consensus we're talking about organisms, but what we're really talking about are collections of the organisms, collections of individuals, or a population. Then if you have a population of several different species, whether it's grass or trees or giraffes or elephants or whatever we have here, that is a community. And then a community or group of communities, along with the abiotic stuff, the non-living stuff like the rocks, the water itself is not living, all right, the dirt, all of that makes up the ecosystem. We're going to talk about each in place over the next few slides. So in order to kind of look into what an ecosystem is and everything, we're going to take a look at what makes up an ecosystem, the components of an ecosystem. All right, and we can think of components like we can think of the components of a computer. To have a good computer, you need to have a hard drive, you need to have some kind of operating system, some RAM. Oh, I know I'm missing other stuff. A power source is probably important. sound card, video card. It depends on what you want to do with this imaginary computer, but you need different components, and ecosystems are the same way. And so for an ecosystem to survive, you need energy, mineral nutrients, water, oxygen, and living organisms. And while we're on land, we see a lot of plants and rocks making up components of land ecosystems. And most of the energy comes from the sun. All right, and that energy gets transformed by photosynthesis by the plants. And if something happens to destroy or change one part of the ecosystem, if one part is destroyed or changed, the entire system is affected. So small changes to what seem like small pieces of an ecosystem can have drastic results for the entire ecosystem. And as we go through this unit and the next few, we will kind of get into a little bit more of this affectedness of destroying or changing a part of the ecosystem. Well, we already talked about abiotic factors. All right. They are non-living factors. They are environmental factors. All right. Air, water, rocks, temperature. They are factors. They are not living. All right. Non-living is abiotic, which means biotic is looking at the living factors of the environment. All right. The factors that are associated with or result of activities of living organisms. All right, and these can be plants, so that takes care of photosynthesis, animals, dead organisms, which then get broken down by other living organisms through decay, and even the waste products of the organism. These are all biotic because they are all associated with living things or made directly from living things. And we organize these living, which are the biotic, and non-living, which are the abiotic. All right, living, biotic, non-living, abiotic. We separate them into various levels. And looking at the biotic things, we're going to start off, and I already kind of hit on this a little bit, with organisms. And they are a biotic factor. Organisms are the living things themselves. They are individuals. You are an organism. I am an organism. Your dog, your cat, your gerbil, your pet snail, I don't know what you have at home. Those are all organisms. All right? So you're an organism, an ant is an organism, a plant is an organism. Each of these things are organisms. So they are living things that carry out life processes independently. So they live on their own. Now they might help out other things, like right here it talks about bacteria living in your intestines. Yeah, you have bacteria in your intestines. They help you break down food, but they are independent living organisms. They do all the properties of life themselves, just like you do. Every organism is a member of a species. And species are groups of organisms that are so closely related genetically that they can produce fertile offspring. And the key word here is fertile offspring. That means they can produce offspring that then can also reproduce. All right, if you ever heard of a mule, well, a mule is the cross between a donkey and a horse. You can get a donkey and a horse to mate with each other. Boom, out pops a mule. This mule, if you then take this mule and find another mule and try to mate those other two mules, they will not produce offspring. So the mule is infertile. It's not necessarily part of the species of a horse. It's not necessarily part of the species of a donkey. It's kind of its own thing that has happened because we made it happen. The natural habitats of donkeys and horses didn't really overlap, so it was never a big problem out in nature until we introduced the two animals together. We would use donkeys to kind of do some stuff, horses for transportation. People would own both, and, you know, sometimes animals have some relations with each other. If you've ever seen dogs run around and sniff each other's butts or kind of just try to hump everything in sight, you kind of know what I'm talking about here. All right, so we got these species. They are closely related. They can mate to produce fertile offspring. That's a very basic, probably most basic of definitions. If you go more in depth, it can get a little bit cloudy. Again, lions and tigers can produce ligers. I believe female ligers, when mated with a tiger, can produce offspring, and it gets really cloudy. But if you think of where lions usually live, you know, the forests and grasslands of Africa, and where a lot of tigers usually live, which is India and Russia, depending on if it's Siberian tigers or Bengal tigers, they would not normally interact with each other, but we bring them together in places like zoos, and scientists want to see what happens if they mate. So you end up with something like that. If you have many members of a species living in the same place, we have a population. Populations are the groups of organisms of the same species that live in the same geographic area. And they interbreed with each other. All right, here it gives you an example: field mice in Maine not interacting with field mice in Texas. Those would be separate populations, because a mouse is not going to make it from Maine to Texas without some help by some outside source. There's a lot of space between there. All right, the big idea is that the members usually breed with one another instead of members of other populations. So we have a population of the greater Rochester area here. We're all a part of it. All right? And for humans, we kind of are now look at things almost like a global population, because we can get to anywhere on the globe if we have the right resources. And we can get there pretty easily and mate with somebody from anywhere in the world. But if you think, before we had planes and trains and automobiles, all right, people kind of stayed with the populations they grew up with. So you get like a lot of families that are famous in certain areas, and those families grew up in those areas. All right, and a lot of times you end up with somebody who is part of your population. All right, yeah, you might go off to college, but then you become a part of the population of that college or that college's town. All right, so it's very weird for a person here in Rochester to end up with somebody in Australia, you know, without some kind of overlap of the populations. It's possible, but more often than not, somebody in the greater Rochester area ends up with somebody in either the Rochester area as well, or Buffalo or Syracuse, or, you know, if you want to even go a little farther, another American. A lot of times Americans marry Americans. Not always. Sometimes differences, especially with troops overseas and abroad and everything. But the big thing is the U.S. population breeds with one another rather than with members of other populations. The same for pretty much every country. All right, so you're more likely to end up interbreeding with somebody from your same population. Let's stop talking about humans. We're a complex, crazy example because we do all these weird things. If we look at bison, bison will usually mate with another member of the same herd. All right, same thing if you've watched any Discovery shows on any of the big cats or wolves or gorillas or pretty much anything there. There's breeding within the same population. Flowers are usually populated by other flowers in the same field. right? Because they're closer to each other, there's a better chance for pollination. Communities are groups of various species, groups of various populations in the same habitat and interact with each other. Alright, so every population is part of a community and it interacts with other populations in that same community. The difference between communities is the types of species. Land communities have a few species of plants that are dominant, and these plants determine the other organisms live in the community. So if we think of some major land communities or biomes, as we'll talk about in a couple of units, what we end up seeing is there's grassland communities where the main plant are grasses. There are woodland communities. You could have deciduous forests, which is the major community that was in this area before we started the development. Those are the pretty leaves that change colors and everything. You can still find them out by the Finger Lakes. There could be the taiga, which is the coniferous forest, forests of pine cones and pine needles. It's a totally different type of forest, different community, different type of plant dominates it. There are the tropical rainforests are dominated by those communities. All right, swamps, marshes, deserts, all of them have unique plants that kind of drive the idea. And a lot of time we think of communities in terms of what kind of plant life is there, and that determines the type of animal life that is there, and so on. And we think of it in terms of plant life because the plants are what get the energy from the sun and make the oxygen and photosynthesis and all that fun stuff. So community, a group of populations that are interacting. And that is all for this unit. Not this whole unit, this lecture. This slide came up again for some reason. I don't exactly know why, but there it is. And that is it. If you have any questions, please bring them into class. Ask myself, Mr. Hughes, whoever you have, for environmental earth science. And you have a good night.